if we charter the waters and we anchor it to traditional masculinities, we might be doing a bit of disservice. We might actually be missing some of the tectonic changes, to use your language, that maybe are occurring.
Welcome back to the In Good Company podcast. I'm Dr. Paul Sharp, Senior Lecturer at the University of New South Wales and researcher with UBC's Men's Health Research Program. My research focuses on supporting men to live happier and healthier lives, and I'm interested in how social connection impacts men's health and well-being. In this special two-part series, I'm joined by my colleague, friend, and mentor, Dr. John Oliffe. John is a professor and Tier 1 Canadian Research Chair in Men's Health Promotion. He's also the lead investigator of the UBC Men's Health Research Program. He's been working in this space for the past 2 decades. I want to chat to John about how our perceptions of men and men's health have changed over the years, what he thinks of the public discourse and sometimes pushback around men and men's health, and where he sees the field going in the future. Thank you for being here, John. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Delightful to be here in Sydney with you, Paul.
Yeah, a bit of a janky setup we've got. For those listening, John is just sitting in the other room, but this is the best way that we could get it set up. So really keen to have this conversation with you today. I want to talk, some high level, big picture stuff. You've been involved in men's health and men's health research for a good amount of time now. You've seen some of these shifts, these tectonic plates shift in society and how we think about men and masculinities, as well as in the research world. So I'm keen to get your perspective today on kind of how you've experienced that. And then we've also got some fun little topics, social faux pas that I want to run by you and get your take on how that relates to men and particularly their connection with each other.
I'll give it my best shot, mate.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Okay, so you've been working in this area for a long time. You've been an amazing mentor to a lot of us, but your research has really focused around men's experiences with health and illness over the past 2 decades, really. How has, reflecting on your own knowledge, how has your thinking and perspectives about men and men's health changed over this time?
Yeah, it's a big question. But just to say, when I started out, 20-some years ago, I think that we were wedded to the idea that masculinity was kind of bad for men in terms of their health. And I think there was a real deficit model that predominated, and it was often wrapped up and tied to testosterone. So there was this weird moment where it was kind of sex and gender. And I remember 2008-9, Claire Sloan and Brendan Goff came out with a paper that kind of said, oh, look, there's some characteristics of masculinities that actually could work for guys, both in terms of their health practices and their illness adjustments and experiences. So that was a kind of a turning point. So that was really key to thinking about things that were malleable. I think the other big shift has been that we belaboured the problems for many years. And I think we're wedded to the idea of solution now. And probably the last 10 or 15 years, you couldn't really write a grant without offering some form of remedy. So I think that's, they're big shifts, big changes, because, something that's malleable to change, we should be able to build something to help. And I think the third thing, probably most recently is that, I feel like there's been this bleeding of masculinities into a political realm, a policy realm. And once upon a time, health was quite separate. We'd sort of use masculinity as explanatory, perhaps even excusatory at times, about certain behaviours and adjustments that guys would make. And I think now we're in a space where those conversations about masculinity are mainstream and they're in the political realm. And so there has been some big changes about the conversations and about the depth of that empirical knowledge and how we do the work as well, for sure.
Yeah, I think in research, for sure, we've done a lot of work to disentangle sex and gender, but also societally, it seems like there's a much broader understanding of what masculinity is. I think most people, if you bring up the topic, they have some sense of what it means and the influences that guys have and how that might be different than other genders. So, during this time, have you seen societal attitudes towards men's health or men's mental health in particular change?
Yeah, I think the mental health piece of it for guys has certainly opened up. And I would, far be it from me to, Pollyanna COVID, but I think when we talk to guys these days, they'll often talk to us about an understanding of anxiety and about depressive symptoms, because I think we all experience some level of trauma, in being locked down and isolated. So I think those conversations have opened us up. I think we were on our way to that. I just think it's probably been hastened by a shared experience that was, for all intent and purposes, it's a form of trauma. And I think coming out, of the pandemic is you likely see the debris of some of the losses that occurred for people too. So I think that's opened it up. My caveat would always be that the difference between what we say and do is often, a fairly big piece. And so sometimes, when we're trying to accommodate mental illness issues or mental health challenges, in particular forums, be it work, or even in our own lives, with partners or friends or family, there's still a way to go in terms of understanding, the limits of that, what that means. But I think at least we're on the dial in terms of getting a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been the last, probably the last decade, I guess. We've got a little bit more open about at least having a conversation that guys do experience some mental health challenges and some things that we might do to, kind of help with that.
Mm-hmm. Around this piece of masculinities, it seems like, we default to it a lot of times as well because it's an easy explanatory piece, but we talk about it fitting within or outside of traditional masculine values, strength, stoicism, independence. Are these still relevant today to guys, or are we over reliant on these kind of ideas?
Yeah, such a good question. So I do think we need to take stock of things that might be shifting and changing that might help us to think about, well, yes, so traditional masculinities, are we talking about the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and how guys were kind of socialized to be certain ways in that time that seemed quite reasonable for that period of time. I think we've got some diversity, some equity, and some inclusion that's occurring now, and have had for well over a decade. Those we might be naming it in those terms, but I think we've had an openness to the plurality that Connell talked about. Being the masculinities, and I feel like every time if we charter the waters and we anchor it to traditional masculinities, we might be doing a bit of disservice. We might actually be missing some of the tectonic changes, to use your language, that maybe are occurring. What if there were some natural movements towards health that some guys were embracing? We risk missing those things if we're always wedded to the idea that masculinity is a certain way and an echo chamber from the 80s, 90s, 70s. But I think we're in different terrain right now.
So in terms of what's contributing to these shifts over time, you have been across the men's health research, for a good amount of time in a good amount of areas, right? The mental health piece, the prostate cancer piece, physical health, mental health, all these sorts of things. And I guess it's more of an existential question. How impactful has the larger body of research been that we're doing in moving that dial, in making or contributing to these shifts in how we think about men and men's health?
To get the conversation, around discourse of masculinities, in any forum, I think you need some sort of empirical base. And I'd say that, I'd love to think that the last 20 years have been worth it in terms of, a little bit of proof that would help us, kind of talk to what we think we know and what we think might be shifting and changing. I think incredibly important that it just doesn't come off as a kind of a politically motivated, kind of conversation, that we've got some empirical base that helps us think about, things that shift and change, and also things that are malleable to change, which are the things that get us up in the morning to build the interventions that might help us, help guys adjust. to certain, frames and different structures that are occurring. So I think it's gone a long way. There's always, critics. And you'll find that, I guess, with all forms of empirical work, where what counts as evidence to some folks, is different. It might be attached to numbers, and the qualitative work has certainly dominated the masculinity space. But in many ways, if you think about it, we've somehow kind of, ruptured some of the constructs that we were actually investigating by getting guys to talk with us about some of their deepest challenges. And so we broke with some of the stoicism, albeit in a research context, to get that conversation. I think that's been vitally important.
Yeah, that's such a good answer. So, there's these other drivers as well beyond the research. I really like how you put that, the research can drive the conversation, and it puts a bit of weight, empirical weight behind it that provides a bit of authority when we're talking about these things, maybe adding to that mainstream conversation. But sometimes these shifts almost seem to happen maybe driven by the men themselves or contextually. And I know you've been interested in things like this rise in interest of non-alcoholic beer, which strikes me as something that the research didn't particularly have an eye on or that even saw coming.
Right. It's a beautiful story. The biggest growth in beer production at the moment is non-alcoholic beer. And I mean, they didn't wake up one day and decide to sell non-alcoholic beer. The marketers responded to the notion that they were selling, less full alcoholic beer. And so they went and spoke to their consumers and found that the 30 to 44-year-olds weren't drinking full alcoholic beer. Like, it's not a popular drink with them. So lo and behold, they produced non-alcoholic beer, and it's their biggest growth market. And they're selling it for the same profit. So is it like their motivations are kind of the same? It's a neoliberal kind of market, but at the same time, I think what I find lovely about the story is that, we didn't actually have to build an intervention. The guys were kind of associating doing more with non-alcoholic beer, like being able to go for a drive, being able to, jet ski, water ski, do all of those things that you couldn't do once you'd had a beer.
Yeah.
So it was associated with freedom, and the companies, the brewers have cashed in on that. They've promoted that idea, but it came from a demand for non-alcoholic beer. So it's like having a beer, switching it in, switching it out, or it might just be that you're going to drink non-alcoholic beer. And they've done an amazing job of producing it where it tastes exactly like beer. It's the same stuff. And so, for me, I just think it's a wonderful story about, we're so busy trying to intervene to make changes for guys' behaviors. And lo and behold, we've got these guys who, are voting with their feet, so to speak. So it's kind of super interesting to me. I'm quite enamored with the idea of it, and I've embraced, non-alcoholic beer myself. And I know it's kind of fun. I never thought I'd say it, but it's kind of been good. Yeah.
Yeah. We were just back in Canada, as you know, and my father-in-law he exclusively drinks non-alcoholic beers now. He was never a big beer drinker to begin with, but he's still on Friday after work, pizza night, he'll have a non-alcoholic beer with that.
Yeah. And they're 58 calories. They're not full of sugar. You have one or two and, you feel kind of like full, and tomorrow's going to be okay. It's such an interesting switch. And when I have them with other folks, it's still really social.
Yeah.
So it's been a bit of a mind switch. And anyway, I'm super enamored about it. I love a beer, but the idea of being able to have one and not really, have to worry about how many I have, because they're non-alcoholic is kind of a good thing.
Yeah. And as you say, it still has those social effects that, you're congregating over a drink at the pub or, at home around food, you're not sipping a water. So it just feels a little different. And I think it kind of facilitates that feeling, that connection around having a beer with a buddy in the same way that you don't need to get pissed doing it.
Agreed. And, there's heaps of advantages in it. And I think it's It's such an interesting thing that there's this response, in a commercial determinants of health, there is a response to demand. And I think that shift, and I don't think it's just 30 to 44-year-olds. I think that was probably a big market for brewers, and that prompted the response. But I think it's across the board. It's just a cultural shift. Of course, there's the argument that perhaps people, guys are drinking other forms of alcohol, higher strength and whatever, and that might well be the case. So it's an emergent area as well that we don't fully understand. And it's interesting too. I was in a supermarket the other day in Vancouver, and the non-alcoholic beer was next to the orange juice, and it's a bit different, that it would be there, and it doesn't attract. We have a sugary drink tax in Canada, and of course it's exempt from that, but it is still taxed as beer.
Okay.
In Canada. So it's a very complex kind of system that is in and around this non-alcoholic beer as well. So when we talk about commercial determinants of health, I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I love that it's driven by demand, Yeah.
And it fits with, we're talking big societal shifts, what has changed. There's a bigger push for guys around health, being healthy, taking care of yourself, taking care of your families. I'm just thinking of other examples of some of those big tectonic shifts that have occurred. I think healthy fatherhood, being a active and engaged dad is another example of a good positive shift that we've seen in society. Again, maybe one that hasn't necessarily been driven by the research evidence. It's been driven by maybe experiential, generationally, guys saying, look, I want to be more involved with my kids than my dad was with me. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I again, times change, and different notions of history and what you're exposed to. And I think some of the involved dad pieces have been very much a kind of a moment where reflecting on the absent provider that some of us grew up with, that perhaps that there could be an adjustment to that, and also as in straight couples where women got more into the workforce and had careers, there needed to be adjustments there, just from a structural point of view. Pragmatically, it couldn't be that the breadwinner was the guy. It needed to be like dual income, and layer on inflation, and you kind of got to buy into that from a pragmatic point of view as well. So there's all of these system drivers. I think what's interesting in the involved father piece is thinking about what exactly it is. So as we unpack this piece about gender equity and equality, and they're different things, obviously, but trying to work through some of that about what the nuances are. And I don't think we can script it. I think it's it's relational and it's by negotiation, but that we're getting those conversations, and it's not somehow stuck in a scripted way that this is what the guy does and this is what the woman does in straight couples, at least. That we're kind of moving beyond that we're getting a relational piece where it's a bit more pragmatic. Yeah.
And coming back to the research and the output piece, we talk about how research has a good place, probably a long-standing place in kind of understanding phenomena. And then I know you have an interest in it. I certainly have an interest in it as well, as making that research evidence applicable to people, in some way, either translating that information back in a way that's helpful to people, or, one step further is in providing recommendations through different avenues. For example, this podcast, is that, and maybe that's where this commercial determinants piece fits, but it seems to not match up as perfectly as maybe we would like it to. It seems to be, people are shifting and changing in healthy ways, right? We've talked about healthy fathers, we've talked about drinking non-alcoholic beer, but then you try and get uptake on different apps or things like that. And these things tend to fall flat on their face sometimes. It's like you're trying to shove health down people's throat. Do we need to think differently about how we are trying to package and sell men's health to people?
Yeah, I would say so. When I reflect back on, the 20 years ago, we'd write the 8,000 word paper. It'd come out in a hard copy journal, and you'd hope that people would find that somewhere and read it. And so it's much more active these days, and so we feel like we need to honour what is often taxpayers' money or donors' money with the work that we do by making it accessible to them. So we certainly do our best to, do things like this, a podcast, or get it on the social media. I think what we lack is budget, a lot of times for the promotion of that and the repackaging of that, because grants tend to, get you a pilot of an intervention and that will be about it. So there's that kind of that tumbleweed effect where you build the intervention, but you've got nothing to sustain it. So we could probably learn a lot from commercial determinants of health in that way, that we could perhaps sustain some things. As far as the social media piece goes, we have an ongoing discussion at the Men's Health Research Program about, well, what channels should we reasonably be on? We can't afford to be on all of them. And then how would we truly assess whether we're making a dent, in terms of influencing people? Or are we just throwing money at, at presence where everybody is at? And that's an ongoing conversation. I think it's well intended, that we'd be on Twitter now X, and that we had a crack at Instagram, for example, but exactly in terms of attribution for changing behaviors, that's a study in and of itself, in many ways. And maybe there's a more sophisticated way of thinking about how we justify the spend, because it's quite a big ticket item these days to sort of promote the work. And there's interventions, and then there's just awareness raising about, for example, non-alcoholic beer. We could easily talk about that and just plant the seed that guys are doing that, and then guys would give it a try, just to know. So again, what level of intervention? So sometimes the intervention is in the description of a change or the description of a problem, even, because it just affirms other people as experiencing it. So yeah, it's a long answer, sorry, but just to say, it's really complex, and we want it to be accessible, and we want it to be meaningful, and sometimes that can be pretty challenging. There's some pretty tough critics out there too, when you get into mainstream media.
That kind of leads into my next question. With increased public discourse around men's health, there's more people involved in it. There's more people that have an opinion. And so I'm just curious what your take is. You go through this work to, from the very beginning, collect some money from a grant. You go out, you collect some evidence, you do your best work to do this empirical, as rigorously as possible. You write it up, you get it peer reviewed, you put it out there, and then some guy on Twitter says bullshit. So, what's your impression of some of those responses or pushback that you get?
Yeah, I'm lucky because, if I'd copped some of the stuff I get now as a rookie, I might have been pretty deeply hurt by it. I kind of laugh it off. There's two things. One I think is that it's data. So when they say, well, you lost me when the research was from Canada, I stopped reading it, or you're a nurse, so what would you know? Or qualitative work isn't research or empirical. I sort of go, well, there's a conversation happening there, but sometimes there's an engagement with the content of what we're saying. And, the neo-traditional masculinities was a classic, where they were sort of like, oh, the progressive guy is such a loser, and the picture of him knitting and stuff like that. And so that's actual data, and that's a conversation, and it actually helps you understand as a researcher that there's some discourses out there, and there's some folks that really are pushing back against what has changed. And then you're forced to think about, well, okay, so that's a perspective. Where is that coming from? How does that play out? It's being expressed anonymously here, or sometimes not, because they email us directly as well.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I take it for what it is in those ways. It can be pretty harsh, and we have a few laughs about it, in the Men's Health Research Program, because it's important to be able to understand it as not necessarily personalized and critical of you, even though sometimes it might be expressed in that way. But yeah, it's an interesting kind of dialogue, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked historically, we've talked present. Just your thoughts on, where are we headed with all of this? Are we going to reach a tipping point? There seems to be increasing pushback. The more you talk about these things, the more the Andrew Tates of the world pop up. These real counter, almost anti-heroes in a way, that are pushing back so much in terms of misogyny and sexism and discrimination, all these sorts of things. Where does that go? Does that fade out, or do we get just increasing tension over time?
It's so interesting. They've got a lot of subscribers. A lot of people listen to them.
Yeah.
They engage in things that are not politically correct, for this point in time in history. And I just don't know, subscriber-wise, whether guys are listening to it and buying in, or whether guys are listening to it and working through it in their own minds because they can't hear it anywhere else because it's so censored. So I'm not sure, the effect. I think a level of intellectual exchange about different points of view is helpful. I think we need to be really mindful that there's great opportunity in the progress and progressions that are being made in terms of gender and gender, equity. I think there's just such opportunity, and I don't say that in a Pollyanna way. I say that, it's like I grew up watching guys play football and never questioned why women weren't playing football. It's like if you introduce it and I watch it, and some of the soccer has been amazing, the women's soccer, and I go, we've been missing out. We've missed out on a lot of things, and I just think that opening up is just so important. And I don't think there'd be a lot of guys that would push back against that. I think we can appreciate hard work and skill and, what people bring to something.
Yeah.
Again, I would like to think, we're going to be progressing anyway. The gendered pieces of the 70s, 80s, 90s, I would like to think will never repeat, that we will continue on in more of an equitable way and more of an equality kind of way, as tough as equality is. So I sort of see it as changing, and again, not to suggest that it's all, bells and whistles and stuff and great things, but guys can actually get a lot from the plurality of masculinity and the diversity that opens up the possibilities for them as well. And I think we're headed in that direction. I'd love to think we are headed in that direction. Yeah.
Fantastic. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation so far. This brings us to the end of part 1 of my conversation with Dr. John Oliffe. Up next, I'm going to be asking John some rapid-fire questions about specific social contexts and dynamics. We'll look at cultural differences between men in Australia and Canada, as well as topics including mentorship, ghosting, and banter. So stay tuned for part 2. I'd like to acknowledge the New Frontiers in Research Fund for supporting this research project, as well as our team at the UBC Men's Health Research Program for producing the podcast. Be sure to check out the In Good Company website to learn more about men's social connection and peer support. You can find the link in the episode description. Also, please leave a rating and review on whatever podcast platform you're streaming from, as doing so will help others discover our show. Have a burning question or an idea for a future episode? We'd love to hear from you. Drop us a line at mens.health@ubc.ca. Until next time, I'm Dr. Paul Sharp. Thanks for listening.